The bid sheet was still warm from the county printer when the man by the window started talking to the clerk like Nell Farrow wasn't standing 3 feet away. "That's Barton Farrow's niece," Darby Schofield said. He had the particular voice of a man who'd spent 30 years being right about things and had stopped checking whether he still was. The one from Asheville. The clerk, a woman named Paulette, with reading glasses she'd pushed up into her hair, looked at Nell the way people look at someone they feel sorry for when they don't want to admit it. "Honey, you understand what that parcel is?" "Bottomland," Nell said. "It's a swamp," Darby Schofield said, not unkindly. That was the part that stayed with her longest afterward, that his voice was almost gentle, the way your voice gets when you're delivering news you're certain about. 38 acres of standing water and cypress root and mosquitoes, and Barton Farrow didn't pay taxes on it for 11 years, because there's not a thing on God's earth you can do with it. The bank assessed it at nothing. I'm not exaggerating when I say nothing. The assessor wrote a 0. Nell set her check on the counter. It was for $280, which covered the delinquent tax minimum, to claim the parcel at the county's distressed property window. It was also every dollar she had in a checking account she'd opened 6 years ago at a branch in Asheville and had never managed to keep above 4 figures for more than 3 consecutive months. "I'd like to file the claim," she said. Paulette looked at the check. She looked at Nell. She processed it without another word, because the transaction was legal and the check was good, and there was nothing else to say, which was the same reason the clerk at every counter in every county office processes transactions without commentary, even when the transaction in question appears to be a mistake. Darby Schofield watched her from across the room while the receipt printed. He had his thumbs in his belt loops and an expression that had started as amusement and moved somewhere more complicated. "Your uncle used to say that land talks," he said, "if you know how to listen." "He did say that," Nell said. "He said it for 40 years, and he died owing $14,000 in back taxes." He paused, not cruelly, just settling something. Some conversations don't go anywhere, is all. Nell folded the receipt and put it in her jacket pocket. She turned toward the door. "I know," she said. She drove back to the property on Route 7 with the windows down because the truck's AC had stopped working in June, and it was the second week of September, and the heat was still the kind that settles on you physically, like a hand pressing down. The truck was a 2001 Ranger that had belonged to her uncle. It was what he'd left her, along with the swamp parcel and a storage unit in Sawyer County containing a broken chainsaw, 4 wooden crates of ball jars, and a handwritten ledger from 1987 that she hadn't known what to make of until she read it twice. The parcel sat off a 2-track that had been a gravel road once, and was now more suggestion than structure. Running between a pine brake and a stand of water oaks down to the edge of the bottomland. She'd been out here 3 times since the attorney had called her in Asheville to tell her about the will. The first time she'd stood at the tree line and looked at the standing water and the cypress knees and the black mud between them and felt nothing in particular, because she was a practical person, and practical people don't feel things in particular when they look at mud. The second time she'd brought rubber boots and walked the perimeter where the ground was firm enough and made notes on her phone. The third time she'd brought the 1987 ledger. Her Uncle Barton had kept records the way some people keep thoughts, not organized, not meant for anyone else, just the habit of writing things down so you don't have to carry them in your head. Most of the ledger was farming accounts, feed costs, breeding dates, sale prices for animals he'd run on leased land in the years before his knees gave out. But in the back, in pencil that had faded unevenly, so some words were clear and some required guessing, he'd written up a water rights registration, filed with the state, based on an original grant recorded in the county deed book in 1743 when the land had belonged to a family named Breck who'd built a grist mill on the creek's south bend. She'd taken a photograph of those pages and sent them to a land attorney in Brevard, whose name she'd gotten from a woman she used to work with. The attorney had called back the same day, which told her something. He'd said, "This is real, but it needs verification, and verification costs money." She didn't have money. What she had was the 1987 ledger and a receipt for $280, and an idea she'd been sitting with since the night she'd sat in the break room of a cabinet shop. 2 days before they closed, and thought about what her uncle had told her when she was 15 years old, and following him around the Hewitt farm like she had nothing better to do. She'd been asking him about the pigs. He'd been running 8 Ossabaw Island hogs on the Hewitt pasture that summer, heritage breed, small and dark, with coarser hair than anything she'd seen in a farm supply catalog. They weren't pretty animals, but they moved across the ground with a purposefulness that was different from how other livestock moved. Not random, not panicked. They were looking for something. "What are they after?" she'd asked. "Whatever was there before," he'd said. He'd been filling a water bucket without looking up. Ossabaws follow old water. Something in how they're built. They can smell where a stream ran 200 years ago, roots it left behind decomposed channel, put them on ground that was wet once and they'll find where it was. He'd paused. Not magic, just honest animals doing what honest animals do. She'd filed that away the way you file things at 15, not knowing it's useful, just knowing it's interesting. She retrieved it at 28, sitting in a break room with $280 and a swamp parcel and no particular direction. The woman with Ossabaw hogs was named Audrey Pitts. Nell had found her through the State Heritage Livestock Registry, a PDF she'd pulled on her phone while sitting in the county library parking lot using their Wi-Fi. Audrey ran 17 animals on 12 acres outside of Macon, which was 40 miles from the parcel, and she answered the phone on the second ring. "You want to borrow pigs?" Audrey said, after Nell explained. "I want to discuss an arrangement," Nell said. "Same thing." A pause. "You know Ossabaws aren't herding animals. You can't move them like cattle." "I know that. And if you put them on bottomland, they're going to go deep. They're not going to stay where you want them. I'm counting on that." Another pause. This one had a different quality, the kind that means someone is reconsidering their initial assessment of the person they're talking to. "What's on the land?" 38 acres of Cypress swamp. Hasn't been touched in probably 60 years. Before that, I don't know. "And why Ossabaws specifically?" Nell told her about the ledger, about the water rights registration, about the mill grant from 1743. She told her what her uncle had said about Ossabaws following old water. Audrey didn't say anything for a long moment. "If your uncle was right," she said finally, "and if there's a mill race on that land, even a collapsed one, those pigs will find it before any surveyor will. That's what I'm thinking. And if there's nothing there, then I've got 38 acres of swamp and a truck with no AC, and I'll figure out something else." Audrey made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I've got a sow named Doris, who I've been thinking is too smart for my current operation, and 2 younger ones who follow her like she owes them something." A pause. "You build me a fence that'll hold, and I'll bring them out. No charge for use. Cost of transport and a handshake. I want photographs when you find what you find." "If I find anything." "You'll find something," Audrey said. "Ground always has something in it. The question is whether it's something useful." The fence took 3 weeks and most of what she could borrow against the truck's trade-in value, which wasn't much, but was real. And real was what she was working with. A man named Clyde Hartman, who ran a small cattle operation a mile and a half up the road, had seen her truck parked at the property line 2 mornings in a row, and eventually stopped to ask what she was doing. She told him. He was quiet for a while. He was a big man, mid-70s, with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned not to waste motion. His face was the face of a person who had been outside most of his life, and had developed the particular patience of that. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the standing water visible between the cypresses. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they've been thinking about for a long time without quite deciding how they feel about it. "Barton Farrow's land," he said. "Yes, sir." "I knew Barton. I figured you might. He filed a water claim in '87. I know because I was at the county meeting when someone challenged it. The challenge didn't go anywhere. Barton had the documentation, but nobody knew what the claim was worth because nobody had found the original structure. Without the structure, the rights are harder to assert." He paused. "Everybody in this county over 60 knows about the Breck Grant. It's been in the deed history for 200 years. Nobody knew if there was anything left to find." "I'm going to find it," she said. He looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who had seen a number of people say things like that, and had developed a considered view on the distance between saying and doing. You got pigs? I'm getting them. You need fence posts. I've got 60 T-posts I pulled from the east field last spring that I haven't done anything with. Some of them are bent, most are usable. She looked at him. I'm not doing it for you, he said, before she could say anything. I'm doing it because Barton asked me to look in on this land about 4 years before he died, and I didn't, and that bothers me more than it should at my age. He turned toward his truck. Come by Saturday. We'll load what's usable. Doris arrived on a Tuesday in late October, and she walked off Audrey's trailer and looked at the swamp the way certain animals look at things that interest them, directly, without ceremony, with complete attention. She was compact and dark, with a snout that had been built specifically for pushing into ground, which was more or less accurate. She stood at the edge of the Cypress line for approximately 40 seconds, and then walked into the trees without looking back. There she goes, Audrey said. Is that normal? For Doris? Yes. Nell watched the 2 younger pigs follow into the shadows between the trees. She could hear them moving in there, the particular rooting sound of pigs engaged with their work, low and continuous and purposeful, the sound of animals that know what they're doing and don't need to be encouraged. She did not see anything useful come of it for 6 weeks. What she saw was mud and more mud, and areas where the 3 pigs had worked the ground down to a depth that surprised her, and some root systems pulled up that looked like nothing she could identify. She managed them on a rotation system she'd worked out with Audrey over the phone, moving them between sections of the swamp on a schedule that kept them from exhausting any one area before they'd done what they were going to do in it. Clyde came out most Saturdays. He didn't say much. He looked at where the pigs had been working and made notes she didn't ask about, and sometimes he adjusted her rotation schedule with a word or two that she'd learned to take without argument because he was usually right. There was one bad night in November when she sat in the small structure she'd built at the property's edge. Not quite a cabin yet, just enclosed and warm enough, with a wood stove and a cot and a table, and she thought with complete clarity that she had made a catastrophic mistake. That Darby Schofield and the county clerk and every person who had looked at her with the quiet pity of people who had already decided the outcome had been correct. That the most honest thing she could do was admit she had made her uncle's particular kind of mistake, which was loving land that didn't love you back in any practical sense. She woke up the next morning and went to check on the pigs. That was the whole of it. She went to check on the pigs, and Doris was doing what Doris did, which was moving across the northwest section with the focused intent of an animal that had been given a job by its own nature and was pursuing it regardless of whether anyone was watching. And Nell stood in the cold morning and watched her and thought, the pig doesn't know it's not supposed to find anything, so she just keeps looking. She kept looking too. What Doris found, she found on a Thursday morning in mid-December. Nell knew something had changed before she could see it, because all 3 pigs were in the same location, the northwest quadrant, where the ground rose slightly before the creek bend, and where Doris had been circling back on and off for the past month without appearing to make progress. Now they were there together, and the sounds they were making were different from the usual rooting sounds. More focused, less exploratory, like animals that had arrived somewhere. She waded through the shallow water in her boots and pushed through the cypress stand and found them clustered around a depression roughly rectangular in shape, 2 feet deep where they'd worked it, extending further in both directions than the debris had been cleared. The sides of the depression were stone, cut stone, not field stone, set in courses with the deliberate care of people who understood that what they were building was meant to outlast them by a significant margin. She stood at the edge and looked at it. Then she took out her phone and called Clyde. I found it, she said. He came in an hour. He stood at the edge of the depression with his walking stick and looked at the stonework without saying anything for a long time, and she stood beside him and let him look, because this was a man who had been waiting for this particular piece of information for longer than she'd been alive. Channel runs east, he said finally, pointing with the stick. See how the courses angle? This is the head race. The mill pond would have been north, probably filled in, but the channel from here to the creek bend is maybe 60 feet. If it's intact below the mud, I can clear it, she said. Not in a week. I'm not in a hurry. He looked at her. Marcus Red is going to hear about this. She'd found out about Marcus Red the month before from the county property database on the library computer. He'd purchased 3 parcels in an L shape around the eastern edge of the creek corridor over 22 months. All 3 downstream of her swamp. All purchased below assessed value from owners who, when she looked at the sale dates, had sold within 6 months of a difficult weather year. She'd driven home without the radio on. I know he will, she said. He moves fast when he hears things. I need a land attorney before he makes contact. There's a woman in Brevard, Clyde said, retired now mostly. She takes cases she thinks are worth her time. He looked at the stone channel. I'm going to tell her this one is. It took 3 more weeks to clear the head race to a point where it was fully documented. 62 feet of stone-lined channel, intact below the mud and decades of accumulated debris, connecting to the creek at the original outflow point that was still, after 280 years, exactly where the grant map said it would be. She had photographs. She had a surveyor's verification. She had the original 1743 deed cross-referenced with Barton's 1987 registration, and a written opinion from the Brevard attorney, whose name was Cassandra Howe, that the water rights were valid and fully assertable. Cassandra had not required much convincing. She'd read the documentation in a single sitting and called Nell back that same evening. Your uncle registered a claim on a documented historical water right with an intact physical structure that predates the state's current water law by a century, she'd said. That's not a gray area. That's settled. What's it worth? To negotiate an annual easement with downstream users. A pause. We'd be starting that conversation at $20,000 a year. Where it ends depends on what those users are willing to say out loud about what the water means to them. Marcus Red came on a Friday in February. He arrived in a black SUV, and he was not what she'd imagined, which was a man in visible hurry. He was measured and careful, with the composed face of someone who had learned that appearing unhurried was itself a form of pressure. He knocked on the cabin door, and she let him in, and she did not clear the county map from the table. He saw the map immediately. He adjusted something in his expression by a degree too small to name. Miss Farrow, he said, I'd like to talk to you about the property. I know what you'd like to talk about, she said. Sit down. He sat. He looked at the section she'd marked, the mill race location, the documented channel, the original outflow on the creek. He took his time with it in the way of a man who has learned that rushing shows your hand. I'll be direct, he said. I have significant investment in the downstream parcels. Your water rights, fully asserted, affect my ability to develop them as planned. They do, she said. I'm prepared to make an offer for the rights in full. He named a number. It was $95,000. It was more money than she had earned in total across the past 4 years of her working life. She felt it the way you feel a current in moving water, a pull, physical and real, in the direction of the number. She did not let it show. What's your development worth? She said, with reliable water access guaranteed. He paused. That's a complicated assessment. Ballpark. He looked at her with the eyes of a man revising his working assumptions. The 3 downstream parcels, developed as planned, generate returns in the range of $2 million over 8 years. And you're offering me $95,000 for the thing that makes $2 million possible. He said nothing. My attorney's name is Cassandra Howe, Nell said. You can call her office to discuss what a legitimate annual easement arrangement looks like. I'm not selling the rights. I'm open to a long-term access agreement priced at what the access is actually worth to your project, verified independently. He picked up his card from the table where she'd set it when he arrived. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down. I'll be in touch, he said. You will, she said. She watched him go down the 2-track and felt the particular weight of a decision she believed was right, but could not yet prove was right. That is one of the harder states to sit in, and she had learned over the past 5 months not to rush out of it, because the rush was where you made mistakes. The flood came in late March, 3 weeks of rain, that filled everything in the county that could be filled and then looked for additional places to go. The swamp absorbed it, not without consequence. She lost 40 feet of fence on the south line and had to relocate one of the younger pigs when her paddock section went under. But the creek stayed within its banks through the downstream corridor because the swamp was functioning as it had always been designed to function, as a retention system built by 200 years of cypress root and organic accumulation, doing the slow, patient work of holding water that had nowhere better to be. Boyd Jennings, whose farm ran along the creek's east bank a mile below her property, came to her fence line on a Sunday. He was a quiet man in his late 40s, who had the habit of addressing his words at the ground rather than the person next to him, as if the conversation were meant for both. "My lower field stayed dry," he said. "The swamp held a lot of the flow," Nell said. "Last time we had 3 weeks like this, 2s and 11. I lost 40 acres of bottomland corn and a barn." He looked at the ground. "My insurance adjuster told me this week that my claim history over the next 5 years will determine whether I can keep this operation viable." He stopped. "The creek staying in banks this spring is the difference between a claim and no claim." She understood what he was saying without him saying it directly. "For what it's worth," Boyd said, "I'm going to tell anyone who asks that this swamp is the reason my operation is still solvent after this spring. I'm going to say that at the next county agricultural meeting." He finally looked up. "I figure that's worth something, even if I can't put a dollar to it." "It's worth something," she said. Darby Schofield came himself 3 days after the rain stopped. He walked down the 2-track without calling ahead, which she took as intentional. Arriving unannounced meant he had to commit to the walk before he could reconsider. And a man like Darby Schofield did not do things that required humility in front of an audience if he could avoid it. He stood at the fence gate and looked at the property, the cleared section near the mill site, the documented channel, the 3 pigs working the ground near the Cypress stand with the complete ease of animals operating on exactly the terrain they were made for. "Ossabaw Island hogs," he said. "Yes. Your uncle used to talk about Ossabaws." He paused. "I didn't listen the way I should have." That was all he said about that. He moved on, the way men like him move on. Not because they've resolved something, but because they've acknowledged it. And that's what they have to offer. "I spoke against your claim at the county meeting last month," he said. "I want you to know I'm not going to speak against the easement negotiation." She looked at him. "My father was wrong to challenge Barton's registration in '87, he said. "I'm not going to repeat that particular mistake." It was not an apology. It was the shape of one, built from the available material, which was a man in his 60s with decades of being right behind him and a genuine if limited capacity to do otherwise. She took it for what it was. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. He nodded. He started back up the 2-track. He stopped once without turning around. "Barton would have been pleased," he said. "He always said land remembers. I always thought that was sentiment." He paused. "I'm less sure about that now." He walked back to the county road. The easement agreement with Marcus Red finalized in May. Cassandra had gotten $20,000 annually, indexed, renewable every 5 years, with a right of first refusal on any structural changes to the creek corridor that might affect downstream flow. Red had come back with a second offer, and then a third before settling, which told her he'd gone away after the first meeting and run his own numbers carefully. By the third offer, they were close enough to Cassandra's floor that they met in the middle without much theater. Nell signed the papers in Bravard and drove back through a May afternoon that was green in the way everything is green after a wet spring, extravagantly and without apology, and she called Clyde from the county road. "It's done," she said. "What did she get you?" She told him. A pause. "That'll hold," he said. "It will." She drove for a moment. "Come out Saturday. Audrey's bringing Doris back for the south section. I want to show you what the channel looks like cleaned out." "I'll be there at 7, he said. 6:30, she said. "I want to check the north fence before you get here." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. 6:30, he agreed. Boyd Jennings' son, a 17-year-old named Ray, who had been showing up at the property on weekends since February on the loose pretext of helping with fence work, was standing at the gate when Audrey arrived the following Tuesday. And Doris walked off the trailer and went directly back to the northwest section as if she'd never left. Ray watched the old sew disappear into the Cypress stand, with the attentiveness of someone filing something away. "How long did it take her to find it?" he asked. "About 3 months of working the ground," Nell said. 6 weeks where I thought she wasn't finding anything. But she was. She was reading it. That's different from finding it. She latched the gate behind the pigs. You can't always see what's being learned while it's being learned. Ray was quiet for a moment. He watched the pigs moving through the cleared ground near the mill race channel, along the cut stone edges she'd exposed over the winter, the line of water running clear and cold in the May morning through a structure built when this state was still a colony. "What made you think the pigs would work?" he said, "before you knew if they would?" She thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it into a speech. Ray was asking a real question, and real questions deserved real answers rather than tidy ones. "My uncle told me something when I was about your age," she said. "I didn't know why I remembered it. I just did." She picked up her fencing pliers from the gatepost. Sometimes that's enough to start with. She walked back to the north fence line and left him there with the pigs and the stone channel, and the water that had been running through that bed for 280 years, waiting for someone with the right kind of animal and the patience to let it work. The County Historical Registry sent a letter in June. The mill race structure had been formally entered into the record. The letter used the phrase significant pre-industrial agricultural infrastructure in a way that was bureaucratic and accurate, and when she read it standing at the tailgate of the Ranger in the early morning, it was closer to what she felt than she'd expected a county letter to get. Her uncle had spent his whole life listening to land that belonged to other people. He'd left her the one piece that was his own, buried under 60 years of swamp water and cypress root, and every decision every person had made to write it off and walk away from it. He'd left her that, and one offhand sentence about honest animals doing what honest animals do, said to a 15-year-old who happened to be listening. She had paid $280 for 38 acres of standing water. She owned a water right that predated the state constitution. She had an annual income from an easement that she had not sold a single acre to secure. The pigs were working the south section now. Doris moved through the soft ground with the same unhurried purposefulness she'd always had, following whatever it was she followed. Old water, old channels, the memory of the land beneath the land. And the 2 younger pigs went where she went and learned what she was teaching them by following her, which was the only way that kind of knowledge ever moved from one living thing to another. Nell stood at the fence and watched them work until the light changed, and the morning went full and warm, and it was time to get back to it.